History hides its darkest crimes in silence until someone dares to open the door. What you're about to hear is not legend, not folklore, but a documented nightmare buried under dust and fear. In one colonial town, a single night erased the line between cruelty and madness, turning power into pure terror. This is where horror stops being fiction and history begins to scream. Mariana in the early 19th century was a town shaped by contradictions so sharp they cut into the lives of everyone trapped within them. Built on the wealth of gold extracted from the earth, it presented itself as a symbol of progress, faith, and order. Yet beneath its cobblestone streets lay a foundation soaked in exploitation and fear. Gold had drawn the Portuguese crown deep into the region decades earlier, and with it came rigid systems of control designed to extract as much wealth as possible while maintaining the illusion of civilization. Churches rose alongside mines, their towers visible from almost every corner of the town, not merely as places of worship, but as monuments to authority, surveillance, and obedience. Faith was not only spiritual here, it was political, enforced, and deeply entangled with power. Religion in Mariana was omnipresent, woven into daily life from birth to death. Bells dictated the rhythm of the day, calling people to prayer, marking work hours, and signaling moments of communal gathering. Yet this faith was selective in its compassion. Sermons spoke of morality and divine order, while ignoring the brutal reality that sustained the town's prosperity. Enslaved people filled the pews at the back or stood outside, their suffering framed as natural, necessary, or even divinely sanctioned. The church did not need to condone violence openly. Its silence was enough. By blessing the social hierarchy, it legitimized the absolute authority of landowners, magistrates, and plantation masters who ruled their domains like private kingdoms. Gold created wealth, but authority maintained it. Mariana was governed by a small elite whose power went largely unchecked. Laws existed, courts convened, and officials carried titles, yet justice was uneven and deeply biased. A white landowner's word could outweigh the testimony of dozens of enslaved people. Punishment was swift for those at the bottom and negotiable for those at the top. Authority flowed downward in a rigid structure, and fear ensured compliance. Those who owned land and people were rarely questioned because questioning them meant challenging the entire system that kept the town functioning and profitable. Slavery was not hidden on the outskirts. It was embedded in the heart of Mariana. Enslaved men and women worked the mines, carried gold, built homes, cooked meals, and maintained the daily comfort of the elite. Their presence was constant, their humanity systematically erased through language, law, and routine cruelty. Violence was not an exception but a tool used to enforce obedience and remind everyone of their place. Whippings, confinement, starvation, and public punishments were normalized to such an extent that they barely registered as events worth recording unless they disrupted productivity. This environment created a dangerous transformation of power. When authority is absolute and accountability non-existent, cruelty evolves into spectacle. Plantation owners and overseers were not merely employers, they were judges, jailers, and executioners within their own domains. Their estates functioned as closed worlds where the law of the crown rarely penetrated. Rumors of extreme punishment circulated quietly, passed between enslaved people, and whispered among free citizens who chose not to look too closely. Fear was contagious, and silence became a survival strategy. Mariana's social order depended on everyone playing their role. The elite attended mass, donated to churches, and hosted gatherings that displayed refinement and moral superiority. Officials documented trade, taxation, and property with meticulous care, while human suffering went largely unrecorded. Enslaved people were reduced to numbers, inventories, and assets, stripped of names and histories in official documents. This bureaucratic dehumanization made even the most extreme acts easier to dismiss, reframe, or erase. The town's physical layout reflected its moral architecture. Grand homes and religious buildings occupied prominent positions, while slave quarters and workspaces were hidden behind walls or pushed to the edges. Yet the separation was never complete. The sounds of labor, punishment, and exhaustion drifted through the streets, a constant reminder of the violence sustaining the town's comfort. Most residents learned to ignore it, convincing themselves that this was simply how the world worked, how it had always worked. Absolute authority thrives where fear is normalized and empathy is treated as weakness. In Mariana, generations grew up learning not to question, not to intervene, not to see too much. Children of the elite were raised witnessing dominance as a natural right, absorbing lessons that power meant control over bodies and lives. By the time they inherited land and people, the transformation was complete. The system did not require monsters at the start. It produced them over time, shaping ordinary men into figures capable of extraordinary cruelty without feeling they had crossed any boundary. This was the world in which unspeakable acts became possible, not as sudden eruptions of madness, but as logical outcomes of a structure built on gold, sanctified by religion, and protected by authority so complete that even the most horrific violence could be carried out beneath church bells and official seals, unnoticed by law, unchallenged by conscience, and absorbed into the quiet routine of a town that continued to pray, trade, and prosper as if nothing had happened at all. Slavery in 19th century Mariana was not merely an economic system, but a framework that redefined morality itself, bending it to serve those who benefited from domination. The law did not simply allow ownership of human beings, it structured society around it, transforming cruelty into routine and suffering into an accepted background noise. Enslaved people were categorized alongside livestock and tools, listed in inventories with prices assigned to their bodies, their skills, their reproductive potential. Once a person becomes property in the eyes of the law, every form of abuse gains a layer of legitimacy because punishment is no longer violence against a human being, but maintenance of an asset. This legalized brutality created a dangerous psychological shift among slaveholders. Discipline was framed as responsibility, and pain was justified as instruction. Whippings, confinement, and starvation were not considered excesses but necessary measures to preserve order. Even extreme punishments could be rationalized if they were said to deter rebellion or increase productivity. The system rewarded those who enforced control efficiently, not those who showed restraint. Mercy was seen as weakness, a risk that could inspire resistance, and resistance was the ultimate threat in a society built on fear. Daily life reinforced this imbalance constantly. Enslaved people woke before dawn and worked until exhaustion, their bodies pushed beyond limits with little concern for injury or illness. Death was not unusual. It was calculated. A body broken by labor could be replaced, and the cost of replacement was factored into the economics of ownership. This cold arithmetic stripped away any remaining moral hesitation. When life is reduced to a line in a ledger, suffering loses its urgency. Public punishment played a critical role in maintaining this order. Violence was not hidden entirely, it was displayed strategically. The sound of lashes, the sight of restraints, the aftermath of beatings served as warnings. These acts were meant not only to punish the individual, but to discipline the collective. Fear spread faster than any overseer could travel. Enslaved people learned to measure their words, their movements, even their expressions, knowing that any perceived defiance could invite severe consequences. What made the system especially horrifying was how deeply normalized it became. Children grew up watching punishments and internalizing them as part of everyday life. Free citizens, even those who did not own slaves, benefited indirectly from the system and learned not to question it. Markets thrived on goods produced by forced labor, homes were maintained by enslaved hands, and social status was tied to how many people one controlled. Slavery was not an anomaly within society, it was its backbone. Legal structures ensured that enslaved people had virtually no recourse. Testimony from a slave was often dismissed outright, especially if it accused a white owner. Courts favored property rights over human life, and investigations into abuse were rare and superficial. Even when rumors of extreme cruelty surfaced, they were often reframed as exaggerations or necessary discipline. The law's silence functioned as approval, reinforcing the idea that owners could act without consequence within the boundaries of their estates. This environment allowed cruelty to escalate gradually. What began as accepted punishment could evolve into experimentation with suffering as boundaries dissolved and empathy eroded. When a person holds absolute power over another's body, the temptation to assert that power in increasingly extreme ways grows. Each act of violence that went unpunished made the next one easier. The system did not just tolerate brutality, it cultivated it, creating conditions where sadism could flourish without resistance. Enslaved people lived under constant psychological terror, never knowing what might provoke violence or how far that violence could go. Obedience did not guarantee safety. Illness, exhaustion, or simple misfortune could be interpreted as defiance or laziness. Families were torn apart without warning, sold to different owners as punishment or profit. This instability shattered any sense of security, making fear a permanent state of existence rather than a reaction to specific threats. The dehumanization was total. Names were replaced with labels, identities reduced to function. Cultural practices, languages, and beliefs were suppressed, as they were seen as obstacles to control. Any assertion of individuality was treated as rebellion. Over time, this systematic erasure served the interests of owners by making it easier to inflict harm without guilt. It is harder to empathize with someone whose humanity has been deliberately obscured. In Mariana, slavery was not a passive inheritance from the past, but an actively maintained system of domination. It required constant reinforcement through violence, law, and social conditioning. The community's willingness to accept this reality was not born solely of malice, but of convenience and fear. Challenging the system meant risking economic loss, social exclusion, or retaliation from those in power. Silence became a form of self-preservation for many, even as it enabled atrocities. Within such a structure, extreme acts were not sudden deviations, but logical extensions of unchecked authority. When the law defines a human being as property and grants another person total control over that property, it opens the door to horrors limited only by imagination and opportunity. The system itself becomes the accomplice, absorbing individual acts of cruelty into its vast machinery, ensuring they are rarely questioned, seldom punished, and easily forgotten by those who benefit most from forgetting. The man at the center of this story did not appear monstrous at first glance, and that was part of what made him so dangerous. In public, he moved through Mariana as a figure of status and respect, his wealth granting him protection long before the law ever needed to intervene. He attended church, spoke with officials, and conducted business with the calm confidence of someone who knew the system existed to serve him. His authority was reinforced daily by the bowed heads of enslaved people and the deferential silence of those who depended on his favor. Nothing about his outward behavior suggested instability. It suggested entitlement. Behind the walls of his property, that entitlement twisted into something far more disturbing. Power over human lives became a private laboratory where restraint slowly vanished. Punishment was no longer just correction, it was assertion. Each act of cruelty confirmed his dominance, feeding a sense of invincibility that grew stronger with every day without consequence. When violence is met with silence, the mind begins to interpret silence as approval. What might have once felt excessive soon felt justified, then necessary, then ordinary. Those who witnessed his behavior understood the danger of speaking. Overseers carried out orders without question, not necessarily because they shared his cruelty, but because refusal could place them in the same position as the enslaved. Fear created complicity. Even those who were uneasy learned to rationalize what they saw, telling themselves that discipline was harsh everywhere, that this was simply how things were done. Rationalization became a shield against conscience. The transformation from cruel owner to something closer to a monster did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, through repetition and escalation. A punishment that once satisfied him eventually lost its effect, requiring something harsher to achieve the same sense of control. Violence became performative, a demonstration meant not only for the victim, but for everyone who might hear about it. Stories traveled quickly among the enslaved, carried in whispers and glances, magnifying fear far beyond the physical boundaries of the estate. What made his actions especially terrifying was the calculated nature of them. This was not a man acting in uncontrolled rage, but someone who planned, ordered, and observed suffering with intention. The lack of empathy was not accidental, it was cultivated. Years of ownership had trained him to see people as extensions of his will rather than as living beings capable of pain. Once that mental barrier was removed, there was little left to restrain imagination. The social structure around him reinforced this descent. Friends and associates avoided asking questions. Authorities benefited from his wealth and influence. The church accepted his donations. Each institution that might have intervened instead became another layer of insulation between his actions and accountability. He learned, consciously or not, that there were no real limits to what he could do on his own land. The estate became a closed world, where his word replaced law and morality bent to his convenience. Enslaved people on the property learned to read subtle changes in his behavior, knowing that small signs could signal danger. A silence held too long, a gaze that lingered, a summons delivered without explanation. Survival depended on anticipating moods and minimizing visibility. Even obedience offered no guarantee of safety, because cruelty driven by power does not require provocation. Sometimes suffering itself becomes the goal. Rumors of his excesses circulated beyond the estate, but they were fragmented and distorted. Some dismissed them as exaggerations, others as isolated incidents. Few wanted to believe that someone of his standing could cross certain lines, because believing it would demand action. Doubt was easier than responsibility. In this way, disbelief became another form of protection for him. Inside his domain, the atmosphere grew heavier, charged with the knowledge that punishment could take unpredictable forms. The uncertainty was itself a weapon. Fear thrives when rules are unclear and boundaries shift without warning. By keeping everyone off balance, he maintained control without needing constant force. The possibility of violence was enough. The night itself did not announce its arrival with anything extraordinary. There were no omens in the sky, no alarms in the streets of Mariana, no warning bells to signal what was about to unfold behind the walls of the estate. Darkness settled, as it always did, carrying with it the familiar exhaustion of forced labor and the quiet dread that followed enslaved people into every hour of rest. What made this night different was not its appearance, but the decision that had already been made, one that transformed ordinary structures into instruments of terror. The brick oven had always been there, part of the working machinery of the property. It was a tool, built for production, used to serve the routines of the estate. Its presence was unremarkable, which made its transformation all the more horrifying. Violence thrives when it borrows the language of normality. Turning something familiar into a weapon sends a message far beyond the immediate act, signaling that nowhere is safe and nothing is neutral. Orders were given quietly, without spectacle. There was no need for shouting. Those tasked with carrying them out understood what refusal meant. Fear ensured obedience more effectively than force ever could. Enslaved people were separated, confusion spreading faster than understanding. In such moments, uncertainty becomes its own form of torture. Not knowing what is happening or why strips away any remaining sense of control. The oven was prepared with deliberate care, its heat rising steadily. This was not a moment of impulsive rage, but of intention. The process itself reflected the mindset behind it, methodical and unhurried. By choosing fire, the message was unmistakable. Fire does not just kill, it erases. It leaves little behind, turning bodies into absence, making proof difficult and denial easy. Those who witnessed fragments of the night carried the memory in silence. The sounds, the heat, the realization of what was being done were enough to fracture any illusion that limits still existed. The act was not meant to be seen by the town, but it was meant to be known. Terror functions most effectively when it travels through rumor and imagination, growing larger with each retelling. The uncertainty of how many suffered and how exactly it happened only amplified its power. Within the enslaved community, the psychological impact was immediate and devastating. The boundary between punishment and annihilation had been crossed. Survival no longer depended on obedience alone, but on pure chance. When authority demonstrates that it is willing to destroy rather than discipline, hope collapses. Resistance becomes unthinkable not because it is impossible, but because the cost becomes unimaginable. Those carrying out the orders were forced into a role that bound them to the crime. Complicity ensured silence. Once someone participates, even under coercion, speaking out becomes dangerous. Guilt and fear intertwine, creating another layer of protection around the perpetrator. The system absorbs the crime by distributing its weight across many shoulders, making it harder to assign responsibility to any one person. The estate itself seemed to absorb the event, its walls containing the evidence, its routines resuming as if nothing had happened. The following morning brought the usual sounds of labor, the usual demands, the usual cruelty. This return to normality was perhaps the most chilling aspect. It demonstrated how easily even extreme violence could be folded back into daily life when the victims were already deemed disposable. Outside the estate, life in Mariana continued uninterrupted. Bells rang, markets opened, prayers were said. If anyone noticed a change, they chose not to acknowledge it. Rumors may have circulated, but rumors are easy to dismiss, especially when they threaten the comfort of those who hear them. The lack of visible disruption allowed the town to maintain the illusion that order still prevailed. The act served its purpose beyond the immediate loss of life. It reinforced absolute control. Fear became more deeply embedded, not just among the enslaved, but among anyone who might have considered intervention. The message was clear. If this could happen without consequence, then nothing was beyond reach. The oven became a symbol, not just of death, but of the total erasure of boundaries. What makes this night endure in memory is not only the violence itself, but the way it exposed the true nature of the system. The law did not intervene, the church did not condemn, the authorities did not investigate. Each institution that remained silent contributed to the act's permanence, turning a private atrocity into a collective failure. For those who survived, the knowledge of what had occurred reshaped every interaction that followed. The estate was no longer just a place of labor and punishment, it was a site of annihilation. Every command carried the weight of that night, every silence filled with the memory of fire. Trauma does not require constant repetition to remain effective. One demonstration is enough to alter behavior for generations. The oven returned to its original function, its transformation unacknowledged in any official record. This return was itself an act of violence, a refusal to mark the crime as exceptional. By allowing the structure to fade back into the background of daily life, the system attempted to erase the event from collective memory. But among those who knew, the knowledge lingered, passed down quietly, shaping fear and obedience long after the flames had died down, embedding the horror not in public history, but in the private consciousness of those who understood that in this world, power could turn anything, even the most ordinary tools, into instruments of absolute terror. After the night passed, silence did not descend by accident, it was actively maintained. Silence was the final and most effective weapon, shaping what would be remembered and what would be erased. In Mariana, silence had long been practiced as a civic virtue, a way to survive within rigid hierarchies. People understood instinctively when to look away, when not to ask questions, when to let rumors dissolve before they hardened into accusations. What happened on that estate demanded this silence because acknowledging it would threaten the fragile order that protected everyone who benefited from it. There were no official inquiries that reached the heart of what had occurred. Records, if they existed at all, were vague, incomplete, or framed in language that concealed rather than revealed. Deaths among enslaved people were easily explained away as illness, escape, or punishment gone wrong. The lack of names made this process effortless. When a person is already reduced to property, their disappearance does not require explanation, only accounting adjustments. Bureaucracy became a shield, absorbing violence into paperwork and routine. Those in positions of authority had little incentive to intervene. Wealth flowed upward, taxes were paid, order appeared to be maintained. To challenge one powerful landowner would invite scrutiny of many others. The system depended on mutual protection, an unspoken agreement that certain lines would never be crossed publicly, no matter how far they were crossed privately. Justice, when it threatened power, was redefined as disorder. The church's response was equally telling. Moral authority existed in theory, but in practice it bent toward influence and donation. Condemnation would have required confrontation, and confrontation risked division. It was easier to speak of sin in abstract terms than to name it where it lived. By avoiding direct acknowledgement, religious institutions preserved their role within the community while allowing violence to remain unchallenged. Silence, framed as prudence, became complicity. Among free citizens, reactions ranged from discomfort to deliberate denial. Some may have suspected the truth, but chose disbelief as a form of self-protection. To believe fully would have demanded action, and action carried risk. Others reassured themselves that such extremes were rare, exceptions rather than symptoms of a deeper disease. This selective blindness allowed daily life to continue without disruption, preserving comfort at the cost of conscience. For the enslaved, silence was not a choice, but a condition of survival. Speaking openly about what had happened could invite retaliation, further punishment, or death. Trauma was carried internally, expressed through caution, fear, and the reshaping of behavior. Stories were not told openly, but passed in fragments, coded words, gestures, and warnings. Memory became something guarded, shared only when trust was absolute. Over time, the event faded from public awareness, not because it was forgotten by those who lived through it, but because it was excluded from the narratives that defined the town's history. Official accounts celebrated prosperity, faith, and tradition. The violence that sustained these achievements was treated as incidental or omitted entirely. History, written by those in power, became an instrument of erasure. This erasure was not neutral. By removing such events from the record, the system protected itself from scrutiny by future generations. Without documentation, accountability becomes impossible. What cannot be proven can be dismissed, and what is dismissed can be repeated. The absence of records ensured that the night remained an anomaly in whispers rather than a fact demanding reckoning. Yet silence is never complete. It leaves traces in behavior, in inherited fear, in the unspoken understanding that certain topics are dangerous. The descendants of the enslaved carried the weight of these unacknowledged horrors, even as society denied them. Trauma does not require official recognition to persist. It embeds itself in bodies, communities, and memories, shaping responses long after the original violence has ended. The cover-up also shaped how violence was normalized in the years that followed. By allowing such an extreme act to pass without consequence, the boundaries of acceptable cruelty expanded. Future acts did not need to reach the same level to be terrifying. The precedent alone was enough. Everyone knew, at least on some level, how far power could go if it chose to. Fear became more efficient because it no longer needed constant reinforcement. What makes this final chapter especially disturbing is not just that justice failed, but that failure was organized, shared, and sustained. No single individual needed to orchestrate the silence. The system itself ensured it. Each person who benefited from stability, each institution that feared disruption, each official who prioritized order over truth contributed to the disappearance of the crime from public memory. The result was a history cleansed of its most damning evidence, leaving behind sanitized stories that celebrated endurance and progress while ignoring the bodies that made them possible. The night in Mariana did not vanish. It was buried, layered beneath rituals, routines, and rewritten narratives. Its survival depended on forgetting, and forgetting became a civic act. But buried history has a way of resurfacing. When fragments emerge, they challenge the stories a society tells about itself. They reveal that horror was not an interruption of order, but a product of it. The silence surrounding that night was not emptiness, but construction, built carefully to preserve power and protect reputations. To remember such events is not to dwell on cruelty for its own sake, but to confront how easily systems transform violence into normality when it serves their interests. The true horror lies not only in what was done, but in how many people allowed it to disappear, how many institutions absorbed it without resistance, and how effectively silence ensured that the flames of that night left no official ashes behind.